and by being present in the meeting, you are giving your consent to being recorded. Members and officers, during each item, please put your hand up to indicate if you wish to speak. I will then invite you at the appropriate time. Please note that the YouTube live stream sound recording is dependent on the correct use of the microphones. Therefore, can I ask you that when invited to speak, you remember to turn your microphone on, and when you have finished, to turn it off. Please reference a page or paragraph number when referring to the agenda papers, and keep your contributions as clear and concise as possible. Finally, I draw your attention to the notice on the agenda papers regarding the different levels within the chamber, and I advise that the fire exit is the door behind this top table. Good afternoon, Councillor Thompson. Thank you very much.
Apologies, Chairman, a previous meeting overran.
Thank you, Councillor, but we knew you were on your way, so no apologies necessary. Thanks. Okay. So we go to item number 2, apologies for absence. Bernard, do we have any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, we've received apologies for absence from Councillors Dewick and Siddle, and Councillor Swain is substituting for Councillor Siddle this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Number 3, the minutes. It is recommended...
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, can the minutes please show that I'm in attendance, please?
Thank you, Councillor Morris. Bernard, can we please... are we talking about these minutes?
Yeah, the minutes for this meeting shows that Councillor Morris is in attendance.
Thank you. Bernard, can we note that Councillor Morris is in attendance, please?
Thank you, Chairman. We always minute councillors in attendance. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you very much. Number 3, the minutes. It is recommended that the minutes of the meeting held on the 6th of September 2021, found on pages 3 to 8, are approved as a true and accurate record. I so move. Do I have a seconder for that motion? Thank you. Councillor Fleming, thank you very much. If any member wishes to raise any matter of accuracy, please do so. Is there anybody? Can we agree those minutes by assent? Agreed. So those minutes are agreed. Thank you, Berna.
Thank you, Chairman.
So we move to declarations of interest. To disclose the existence and nature of any disclosable pecuniary interest, other pecuniary interest or non-pecuniary interest relating to items of business on the agenda having regard to paragraphs 6 to 8, inclusive of the Code of Conduct for members. Members are reminded that they are also required to disclose any such interest as soon as they become aware, should the need arise throughout the meeting. Would anyone like to declare any interest? So we have nobody. Thank you, Berna.
Thank you.
Public participation. I can advise that we have not received any submissions from members of the public. So that takes us to agenda item 5, found on page 9 to 90 of the meeting pack, which is the report. Mr. Quelch, can you please present the report?
Thank you, Chairman. Well, you've got my report, and my report has 2 appendices. That is the new model code that's been produced by the Local Government Association, and it's the revised version of May of last year. I say revised version because this one is the 3rd revision. And this is the 3rd and final one, as far as I know, for the time being. You also will have a 2nd appendix, and that is the guidance that's recently been issued on how to interpret the new Code of Conduct. As far as my report is concerned, you'll see I've set out the history of how we've got where we've got to in terms of this particular new Code of Conduct, and it is the result of a recommendation made by a government committee called the Committee on Standards in Public Life. And back in the beginning of 2019, they recommended that a new model code of conduct should be produced for local government. The Local Government Association took up the task, and this is the result, what you have in your hands in Appendix 1. Now, it is fair to say that there hasn't been a total national take-up of all local authorities of this code. There have been some issues of clarity about the code that have made some councils a bit wary, and that is particularly the case with the Essex authorities. None of the Essex authorities so far have adopted the code, but that is about to change because the revisions made, particularly the final one on the 17th of May of last year, they satisfy pretty well all the monitoring officers of all the Essex authorities. We had a combined meeting to discuss it, so at least we were working together. And I now know that the County Council plan to push forward with adoption of the code, and although they haven't got a set date, I know their monitoring officer is thinking in terms of June. And I believe most of the other district councils are either in the process of moving towards adoption or will be doing so shortly. The only thing I would like to say about the new code itself, I think it is an improvement on the code we now have. I think it builds on some of the really important principles that have now been established through that code and being practiced by councillors throughout the country. What it does is, and you'll see in my report, I mention a few things that I think are good about the new local code, and that it's been written in the first person. That makes it much easier to read. And also in the code, and I don't mention this in my report, but if you read Appendix 1, you'll see also in the code itself there are explanations, whereas in the old code there were none. So it's much more self-explanatory. And of course, the second really valuable point is there is now guidance that's been produced by the LGA on how to interpret the code, and it's full of examples. And I personally think it's a really good piece of guidance. So hopefully there'll be, if members have any doubt how to interpret the new model code, those will be dealt with as members read the guidance. In fact, you can dispense of me. You won't need to come to me any longer. You'll just read the guidance and it'll all be totally clear to you. Perhaps of real significance to members is this whole issue of declaration of interests. And as you know, under the old code, there are 3 categories of interest. There are disclosable pecuniary interests, which are defined in statute in the Localism Act. And if you don't declare those, you not only breach the code of conduct, but you also commit the crime. They're called disclosable pecuniary interest. Then the other one is other pecuniary interests, which are just 2 issues, and they're very specific, relating to contractual relationships between the authority and the councillor. Very rarely declared because they often just don't. That's rare that actually there are other pecuniary interests. And the third one, which causes a lot of problems sometimes for everybody, is what is a non-pecuniary interest. Now, the one thing about non-pecuniary interests is they only apply to the member themselves. Whereas in relation to the new code, non-pecuniary interests not only embrace spouse or partner or cohabitee, but also relative or close associate. So that is really widened, and I think that was a really big weakness under the present code, that there could be an issue that related to your brother or your sister. You didn't have to declare that as a non-pecuniary interest, but it might affect their well-being. For example, let's just say there was, you were looking at a local development policy, the new plan, and it could potentially affect your brother or your sister or any other relative. You wouldn't have had to have declared that as a non-pecuniary interest because it doesn't relate to you. You could argue, well, it does because it's your well-being, and how your sister or brother is affects your well-being, but it wasn't explicit. It wasn't explicit. Now this new code is explicit that any interest that affects your relative or your close associate, you have to declare. So under the new code, there are also 3 categories. There is still disclosable pecuniary interest because that's statutory, and that remains. And those are defined under the new code in the table 1, in appendix 1. Then there are what are called other registrable interests. And those are those defined in table 2 of appendix 1, which are really to do with unpaid directorships, whether if you're a member of a charity or a public body or other body that's influencing public opinion, you have to register those, and at a meeting, if there is a direct, let me just find the new code because I'm still familiarizing myself with it. If there's a matter arising at the meeting which directly relates to the financial interest or well-being of one of these other registrable interests in table 2, then you'd have to declare that as well. And the third category is non-registrable interests. And you might say this is akin to the non-pecuniary one if you want, but it's quite different in many ways because it's broken down into 2 types of interests. You've got financial interests that are non-registrable, and you've got well-being interests. Okay, and within that, you have to ask yourself: does this particular is this matter on the agenda something that directly relates to this non-registrable interest? This financial interest or well-being interest that could be not only you, it could be your partner or your spouse, or it could be a relative or a close associate. And then there's then you've got to ask yourself the question: if it doesn't directly relate, does it affect your financial interest or well-being or that of your partner or close associate or relative? The reason is, in the first case, if it's a directly relatable issue, then you cannot debate the issue and you cannot vote. And that's the case for the other 2 as well: the DPI, disclosable pecuniary interest, and the other registrable interest. If those are engaged, you cannot vote or discuss. You have to leave the room. And so with the third non-registrable interest, if it's directly related, you likewise cannot vote, you cannot debate it, and you must leave the room. Now, in the case of a non-registrable interest that only affects you, your financial interest or well-being, you then have to go on and ask 2 other questions. Does it affect it more than the financial interests of the majority of the inhabitants of the ward, your ward, affected by the decision? And if it does, would a reasonable member of the public, knowing all the facts, consider that this interest would affect your view of the wider public interest? Now, it all sounds, I made it sound rather complicated, I know, but actually, as you start to digest it all, it isn't as complicated as it sounds first of all. So we've got three categories. We've got the under the new code, the disclosable pecuniary interest, which is the same as under the existing code. We have a new interest called other registrable interests, which relates to, as I said, public interest bodies, unpaid directorships, etc. And then there is this third new category of non-registrable interests, and you have to look at whether they directly relate. Directly relates is where, say you've got your sister again, and she's put in a planning application, that would directly relate to her well-being, and so therefore directly relates to you. And then you have to ask, if it doesn't directly relate, does it affect? So there might be someone that puts in a licensing application near to your house. Now that doesn't directly relate to you, and it is a non-registrable interest, but it might affect your well-being, your enjoyment of your property. And then you'd have to go and ask yourself the question, does that affect me more than the majority? Yes, it does. And would a member of the public, knowing all the facts, think it would affect my view of the wider public interest? And you probably conclude that Joe Public would think that, in which case you then have to not only declare the interest, you neither could vote or discuss the matter. So that's my brief run view. All the other things like bullying, like bringing the authority into disrepute, like using your position for your own advantage, those remain the same. I think they're made a little bit clearer, and the explanations in the code I think are helpful. And of course you have the advantage of this hot off the press guidance from the Local Government Association that I've already mentioned, which is in your appendix 2. There is one thing, finally, that you may have picked it up. If you go to page appendix 1 and you go to page 11 of appendix 1, and you will see that that's the disclosure of non-registrable interests. And you will see that at paragraph 9, it reads, where a matter referred to in paragraph 8, that's a non-registrable interest, affects the financial interest or well-being to a greater extent than it affects the financial interest of the majority of the inhabitants of the ward affected by the decision, and I personally think that should read to a greater extent than it affects the financial interests or well-being of the majority of the inhabitants, because paragraph 9 starts where a matter affects the financial interest or well-being of the particular councillor, obviously, to a greater extent than it affects the financial interests of the majority of inhabitants, etc., etc., etc. I think that's an omission. Now, the reason I think that is because the guidance indicates that well-being, in making that assessment, whether it affects you more than the majority of other inhabitants, that is involved as well as just financial interests. So my view would be that if members are minded to recommend to full council the adoption of this new code, that should be added in, that particular phrase, or well-being, under 9A. As to the recommendation itself, I put in something you might think is a little bit bold of me, asking you asking council to give me a little bit more power, in the sense that we don't know when the other authorities in Essex are going to adopt the code. And one advantage of if Essex County Council adopt the code and all the districts don't, then there would be those dual-hatted members who are both county councillors and district councils would then be operating to a different code. And by the way, incidentally, that's also the case within our own district. If this district council adopts the code, but parishes don't, and they're not obliged to, they can stick with the old code, then those members that are district councillors and parish councillors would have the misfortune of operating under two different codes, which can be very confusing. So there is an advantage, I think, in this district council if it goes for adopting the code, timing the taking of effect of the code at the same time as the county council, so there isn't a period where dual-hatted members are operating under different codes. Hence my suggestion that that you recommend to council that there is the adoption of the code of conduct to take effect by, so that there's the backstop date, 1st of November 2022, unless brought into effect prior by the monitoring officer, depending on when Essex County Council bring into effect the new code of conduct. I hope that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, Councillor Mays.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do we have any idea as to when Essex County Council are going to be debating this point, please?
I know that Essex County Council are at this moment in the process of moving towards that. They obviously can't give a date because they haven't got through the process yet of deciding whether to adopt it. But I know they would like to do so sometime in June, if possible.
Okay.
Thank you.
So is that the report? Thank you.
Yeah, and that's it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Quelch. So shall we go to this recommendation and then open it up to debate as it stands?
I think yeah, I mean yes, you could ask for a proposer and a seconder of the recommendation, and then obviously it's debate.
And then we'll
Yes.
decide whether or not we wish to change the
Or
recommendation.
you could do it like a planning application if you wanted to, where I know the idea is you just debate the report and then you have a motion.
Well, I think we'll go. I think we'll go to this recommendation, and then we'll have the debate, and then see what the end result is, and then if we change anything, we can vote on that. So I shall go to the recommendation, and the recommendation is to council that it adopts the Model Code of Conduct at Appendix 1 version of May 2021 to take effect by the 1st of November 2022, unless brought into effect prior by the monitoring officer, depending on when Essex County Council bring into effect the new Code of Conduct. And I think what that means is that by November the 1st, 2022, we will adopt this Code of Conduct unless Essex County Council bring their Code of Conduct forward, this model, and then we will fall in line at the same time. Is that correct? So that's the recommendation. So could I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Helm.
I'll second that.
Thank you very much, Councillor Helm. So now I shall. Sorry, Councillor.
Sorry, Chairman,
Thompson.
just a small clarification. Are we assuming that the slight amendment that Councillor Mr. Cruz suggested is included in that?
I was going to recommend this recommendation and then let yous decide that, and if that's the case, we'll change the recommendation.
In that case, can I propose the propose the amendment, because you have to deal with the amendment before the.
Right, thank you
Can I
very much.
propose Mr. Quelch's suggestion as an amendment to this?
Thank you very much, Councillor Thompson, and
I'll second that.
thank you very much, Councillor Helm. So we had that. So thank you, Councillor Bill.
I'd like to commend Ms Quelch on his report. It was a long read. The 8 pages plus a few blanks.
Great.
One of the questions I did have was, why wouldn't other councils approve this and all come under one umbrella so that you've got standardisation, which to me makes sense, because otherwise, it's going to get tacky. And really, I think to myself, if they're all singing from the same song sheet, it makes a lot more sense. I'm thinking, what reasons would they have for not adopting it? Because it is a lot clearer, and it does tie down to certain issues and highlight specific issues as well. Yeah, I mean, I don't know why it's not been standardised, as it's an LGA recommendation, etc., etc.
Mr. Quelch.
Yeah, that thinking was exactly the thinking that the LGA had in producing this improved code, building on the good work of the old code. And their thinking was, we're going to improve it, everyone's going to go in for it, there'll be a sort of national code. But of course, the Localism Act gives discretion to each local authority to adopt its own code. There are certain mandatory things like the disclosable pecuniary interest, because they're very serious. But anything else is discretionary. Now, I think the reason that some councils have delayed is that their monitoring officers, like the ones at Essex, have been saying it's an improvement, but it can be improved upon even more. So rather than adopting a code that might well be revised, if we push the LGA to improve it, and then we've got to go back to our members and go through another adoption process. I think some MOs, just like the MOs in Essex, wanted to take the opportunity of making it even better. So the reason that we delayed as MOs was we could see some ways of just improving it, and so we made representations to the LGA, and I think other MOs did from other parts of the country. The result was the revisions we've now got. So I think now we're at a stage, certainly in Essex, we're at a stage where pretty well most of the MOs are satisfied with the code. They think it's an improvement on the existing one, and we're probably not going to get any other changes.
Yeah, that was my point. We agree this, and then they say, oh, well, we want to change this, and it's going to keep coming backwards and forwards. If you're saying this is like the final draft, that makes a bit of sense.
With a proviso, it's the final draft, it's the final version, but the LGA have promised that they will review it every year. Now, a review doesn't mean a change, but there's potential for a change. So if they do change it, then we'll have to come back again.
So could I just ask, I mean, for instance, we are going to put in a small amendment. So then does that, just to be the devil's advocate, do we then notify somebody and everybody's code of conduct changes accordingly?
No, because it's for each council to accept the model. Don't forget, it's a model code of conduct. It's not a mandatory code of conduct. It's mandatory that we have a code under the Localism Act. That is law. But it's not mandatory what it should contain. So this is a template. But obviously the Local Government Association are hoping that it will be accepted lock, stock and barrel without amendment. I don't know whether members did read picked up the point that my point about, I think there's an absence of the words or well-being, but I based that on the guidance. So I'm really only adding in what I think the LGA intended. I may have made a mistake, and there may be some good reason for this, but I can't see what the good reason is at the moment. And as I say, it doesn't really fit in with the guidance examples. So,
And if you look at paragraph 8, it's actually replicated, so it should be repeated in paragraph 9, as you say.
So the answer to that question is, I mean, that's very helpful from Mrs. Casey, Chairman. I think that answers your question in that it's for each council to decide. We don't have to report to anybody else.
So that seems fairly clear. Anybody else? Councillor Mays.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question really revolves around whistleblowing. There's no real mention of whistleblowing specifically in the code. And my concern is that usually whistleblowing is as a result of a confidential conversation with somebody at some point in doing our work. How does the code either protect us, protect them, and we're not found to be bringing the council into disrepute? I'm just a bit concerned that there is nothing at all that relates to whistleblowing in this guidance. Thank you.
Whistleblowing relates to employees. The whistleblowing legislation and the policies that we have. We already have a whistleblowing policy for the council. And if an employee made a complaint against a member under this code, they will be protected by that whistleblowing policy, which is a standalone policy, which covers not only this code of conduct, but it just say an employee whistleblew on another employee, they would equally be covered. With members, as far as members are concerned, who make a complaint, you're not. Whistleblowing is an employee piece of legislation. It's to protect employees, and you're democratically elected members. You're here not in that capacity. You're representatives of the public. So this council couldn't discriminate against you like it could an employee. Managers in an organisation might be able to discriminate against an employee because they complained, maybe unrightly complained, whereas there isn't that possibility. Amongst members, there may be a dislike of one another or a sense of, why did you make that complaint against me? But that's not something that would be expressly dealt with in the code. What is dealt with in the code is that member must treat member with respect, and member must not bully member. So insofar as if a member did make a complaint and then was picked on by the councillor concerned, that would then be another grounds for complaint. Disrespect, bullying, intimidation, harassment, all those sorts of things.
Could I just come back on that?
Of course.
It still leads me to some sort of concern though, because often whistleblowing is usually as a result of conversations not necessarily between two employees. In this situation, because it's a little different from a standard company or business that you might be working in, and I'm not entirely sure that members could find themselves somewhat gagged if there was no mention of perhaps wrongdoings that have been going on, bad practices, poor practices, a whole range of stuff that go on in businesses. But just because we are members doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't have the same level of both support and protection that are afforded to employees. It's a statement as much as a question, but I think there's a question in there somewhere.
Yeah, Chairman, I think that I see the issue that Councillor Mays is raising, but in the case of an employee, clearly policies can be brought into play so that managers or fellow people in the team do not discriminate against that person simply because they've blown the whistle. In the case of councillors, I'm not sure who would be the person. Would it be the leader of the council that would be protecting that councillor? But there again, then that's what the code is here for, really. And if a whistleblowing member was being mistreated, abused by other members, then, as I've said, that's grounds for complaint under the code, and that should come to the monitoring officer, rather than, say, somebody else in the council, like a leader or the chairman, somehow dealing with this independently of the code. That would, in a sense, be sort of bypassing the code, which wouldn't be appropriate. So I can't, although I see the problem, I can't see a legitimate way round it.
You happy with that, Councillor Mayers? Is that
Happy might be going a bit far,
Yeah.
but yes, I accept what you're saying. And
willing to let that one go?
for the moment.
Okay, thank you.
I'll sit and listen. Thank you.
Okay, so let's move along for a little while then. Councillor Swain.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I've got a number of questions of my own, but it just...
Would it be helpful if we put the lights on? I'm just thinking for the,
Yeah,
for the video
thank you.
feed as well.
Thanks, Maddie.
I just wonder, in relation to that last point, if a whistleblower doesn't want to go to a manager or director, but goes to a councillor, is there a question there that the councillor can raise the issue without identifying the whistleblower?
Sorry, Councillor, would you mind repeating that, because we were doing lights?
If the whistleblower goes to a councillor because they don't want to go to a manager or director, can the whistleblower's identities still be retained, although the complaint is actually then funneled to a councillor?
So you're thinking of a situation where an employee is concerned about a councillor, but they go to a third councillor.
No, not concerned about a councillor, concerned about their work position.
Oh, right, I see what you mean. Okay. Well, under the officer member protocol, that wouldn't be appropriate, because the member officer protocol would say employees shouldn't be going to members about work-related issues. So if a particular employee has a concern about their terms of conditions or the way they're treated, they should be going to another employee. They should be going to HR, for example. They can't talk to their manager, say the manager is the problem, then they need to be going to human resources to raise that issue. They shouldn't be using a counsellor to deal with matters that relate to operational issues. So I would say that was inappropriate behaviour by the employee, and the counsellor should say, sorry to hear that, but you need to go and speak to human resources about this.
Right, can I raise a...
Please carry on, absolutely. Provided you're happy, Mr. Quelch, to take these questions.
I'll do my best.
I don't know if Councillor Mays wants to just have a withdrawal.
Yeah, thank you very much, Councillor Swain. Should that protocol actually be one of the incorporated documents in this code of conduct?
There's many documents in the Constitution. It's like the local development framework, which is composed of lots of different documents. And so our Constitution is the same, it has lots of folders. One of those is the code of conduct. And the member officer protocol would also be part of the Constitution. So I don't think you would append it. It's part of the library of documents, like the procedure rules, for example, for meetings. That's part of the Constitution.
What about cross-referencing it?
I think you could cross-reference many documents. And then it becomes a cumbersome document. And the Constitution is available to the public. This would be a part of a library of documents that are available to the public. I don't know how, if you cross-reference one, why haven't you cross-referenced another? And then why haven't you cross-referenced another? And it becomes, I think it becomes a little bit unmanageable, personally. I don't know, Chairman, whether you want to whether the independent person wants to make any comments.
Well, I think probably the independent person probably wouldn't want to make any comments on this. I think we have sort of investigated this, unless you would like to, Mr. Mitchell.
Only as that I used to be a local authority chief executive and would have dealt with that sort of issue where a member of staff has raised a problem via a member and it's then come to me. It's cumbersome, but it worked, but it's not something I would recommend as a practice, because there can be various motivations why a councillor would wish to move a complaint from an officer that might not always be in the right interest of the authority. And there are proper processes for dealing with staff complaints to members, and I think they need to be exhausted before any alternative approach is made. That would be my comment, Chairman.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to Councillor Swain's next question, if that's okay. Thank you very much.
It's the first of several. The way I read it, when a councillor accepts an appointment, they have to sign the code of conduct. Therefore, do not the two go together? And if the code of conduct is breached significantly, seriously, it sort of invalidates the acceptance of office or the position as councillor.
Chairman, that you used to, under the old template for accepting office as a councillor, there was, and I agree to abide by the code of conduct. That is no longer a part, as far as I can recall, that is no longer a part of the template that the government have provided. So in your acceptance of office, all you do is Fred Bloggs or Frida Bloggs, accept the position of member for the particular ward. There isn't that phrase, sentence in any longer, as far as I'm aware. But the Localism Act 2011 is even better, because the Localism Act says that every council must have a code of conduct to regulate member conduct. It's mandatory. Within that section is a requirement that members obviously need to abide by the code of conduct. That's its purpose. So in a way, you don't need that extra statement that used to be in the template, because the Localism Act now requires members to abide by the code of conduct. It's law. It's legislation.
Yes. So every member has to accept the code of conduct.
Yeah.
Not in any sense optional. But under the Localism Act, you can then be sort of breaching the Localism Act if you breach the code of conduct, or if you say you don't accept it.
The Localism Act says, number one, you've got to have a code of conduct. That applies to all members. And if you breach the code, it goes on to say that the local authority has to have a procedure set up for investigating complaints.
Yes, so that diverts it to the... yes, fine, thanks. The second is, with due respect to Mr. Mitchell, concerning the independent person. There are several things here. It says there should be two, and we've gone along with that. I'm not sure what the reasoning is, whether it is simply to have an alternative or whether it is desired that you have two IPs present to consider. This partly goes to the question of the role of the IP. And I notice it is mentioned, well, somewhere, that there is consideration of changing or adding to the role of the IP. Do you have any inclination as to how the IP's role might be amended?
I have to plead ignorance on that one, Chairman. I mean, is that a government consultation document?
No, I don't. think so. I think it, well, I can't find it in here, but it refers to a whole series of possible changes. I don't know if this is the LGA's ideas or not.
I haven't read those, so I'm sorry, Chairman. I have to plead ignorance on that one.
So is yes, no indication of how it might change.
You're ahead of me on that one, Councillor Swain.
I'd just like to add, particularly in this context of this meeting, that we don't have any parish council representatives. I think they are very important on the JSC, and I think we need to pay close attention to how we get parish council members onto this committee. It doesn't seem to work very well the way we do it as a sort of general circular through the EALC. And in a sense, I mean, they double up with the role of the IP, in my mind, as being sort of external, and also giving the view as from a parish council. And we probably all know that conduct at parish councils can be quite different from the way councils operate at district or county level. So I do think we need to pay attention to getting those councillors.
Chairman, can I just, I'm not sure that's the question, but just to clarify, we no longer are, if you remember, there was a decision by council about a change to the way in our constitution we seek nominations of the 2 parish representatives on the standards committee, because as you rightly say, Councillor Swain, then there needs to be 2 according to our constitution. We used to seek to get nominations from the EALC, but that proved problematic. So now the new procedure is that we need to go out to all parish and town councils for nominations. Should there be none forthcoming from that first trawl, then the district council will go to Malden and Burnham town councils, as really the 2 bigger councils, and ask in default of nothing coming out from the first trawl to nominate 2 parish council representatives. That is actually what we're doing at this very moment. Mrs. Casey is actually in the process of doing that, following that very procedure. So for statutory annual, it is hoped in May that there will be 2 parish representatives that can be put onto committee.
I think that's very unfortunate, and I assume that all parishes have been trawled on this one. I think it should be emphasised to them how important it is for smaller parishes to have a representation on it. The next one is on best practices. It mentions there about publishing a statement on how we define or what we treat as being in the public interest.
Right.
Not quite sure which one that is, but is that something we should produce so that we state?
Are you referring, Councillor Swain, to the best practice appendix? Going to appendix 1 of your report. If you go into that, there is also, confusingly, appendix C on the model code of conduct itself. And that gives you the Committee on Standards in Public Life best practice. And one of those is, one of the best practices, let me just find it because you caught me off guard on that one. Yeah, best practice 6. Councils should publish a clear and straightforward public interest test against which allegations are filtered. Is that the one you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay. You, other members of this committee may recall that was produced, I think it was end of last year or the beginning of 2020 or the beginning of 2021. I'm not sure. Mrs. Casey, I'm sure, will have all these matters at her fingertips. Where this committee defined a public interest test, and that is now a part of the Constitution. That's it being put into the articles, the complaint procedure.
That is correct. 2021.
Yeah, 2021. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Okay. If I go to page 31, there's mention of councillors board councillor, as being a quasi-employer. This is a novel phrase to me. I'm just wondering what the importance of that phrase is.
Chairman, that's I think that's in reference to potential, quite difficult, but the way that councillors treat employees can be grounds for an unfair dismissal claim or constructive dismissal claim by an employee. In other words, if a councillor is mistreating employees, even though they are not the employer, Malden District Council is the employer in the contract of employment, there's case law that indicates that bad behaviour by members can result in constructive dismissal of employees, and those employees could have a rather, if they're senior, can have a rather large payout because of it. So I think that's the reference to being quasi-employers, in the sense that the conduct of members towards employees is very important. And there have been cases in the past where employees have walked from local authorities because of badly behaving councillors.
May I go to page 33, paragraph 4, which talks about improper influence on fellow councillors in group meetings, which may be difficult to demonstrate, but it seems to me that that is a, and it touches on another comment I made to you when we were talking about, you were asking for views on this, about the role of groups and group leaders in any disciplinary action, and I made the point that I didn't think that they should enter into it, but this does seem to rather point the finger, as we say, at undue pressure to vote in particular ways, which I guess happens quite frequently.
Chairman, I think the
talking about whips here.
well, I think it may be whips, which will be in the bigger councils, probably, but I think the words are undue.
Yes.
And so it's recognised that if you're in a group, politics works that we know that from listening to the debate in Parliament about all the issues that have been coming up in Parliament that you are all familiar with, and about the role of whips. And it's recognised that whips are a part of modern and past political life in British politics. That would also be the case in local authorities, maybe less so, but still the case. So I think the words are undue pressure.
Yes, yes, and how it would actually surface.
So if there was a whip, Chairman, if there was a whip that was bullying members and threatening them with some benefits they will lose, or we will no longer we were thinking of putting you forward to be chairman of a particular committee, and if you don't vote in this particular way, then you will lose favour. That's undue.
My next point, I think, has just been covered by you, because you said about recent case law protecting officers from unwarrantable comments. So that's there in case law. My last point then is page 75. It talks about councillors not on a committee attending as a member of the public. I'd been led to believe that that was impossible. A councillor couldn't be a member of the public.
It depends on the context. This is a difficult area. I admit that, and I've not always been clear in my own mind about that. I admit that. Which particular paragraph are you referring to, Councillor Swain?
It's on page 75.
Page 75? Yeah, I'm on page 75. My personal view, without haven't found the particular paragraph you're referring to. But in the code, it talks about you can only, if you have an interest, one of those 3 interests in the new code of conduct, you cannot speak to that particular item, and of course not vote either, unless there is a right for a member of the public to speak. But that's not saying, maybe that's what you're referring to, that's not saying that a member has the same, can also be a member of the public as well. That's simply saying that a councillor shouldn't be put into a worse position than a member of the public if they have an interest, which I think is a different thing. Might be quite nuanced, but it's different.
That is, if there is a right in principle for a member of the public to
Correct.
take part on that right, not that there actually is one present.
Yeah. For example, in a planning application, members of the public in this authority have the right to speak to a planning application, to address the committee. If a member had if a member had an interest, then under this new code, it's not clear under the old code, but under this new code, it's clear now that that member can speak because the public speak, not because they are a member of the public, but they are having the equivalent right as a councillor that can no longer debate or vote because they have an interest. If that makes sense.
Well, not entirely, actually.
Okay.
I mean, does it mean that a councillor from outside the area can participate in an area planning committee as a member of the public?
Yes. A councillor from another authority, say a parish councillor, could come to Malden District Council as a member of the public, or they could come as a nominated representative of that parish council to address the committee on a planning application.
If can a member attend and speak at another area committee, an area that's not where that councillor is?
Oh, I see. You're a member of this district council. Yes. Oh, I see what you mean. Sorry. On an area committee. No, because they're not a member of the committee. That only, see, we're talking about here where a member declares an interest. And where a member declares an interest, they can't debate the issue anymore, they can't vote, and they have to leave the room. But if members of the public have the right to address the committee, that member of the committee who otherwise would have been able to vote and debated but can't because they have an interest, can, before they leave the room, have the same say as a member of the public.
I see, yes.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So another member, a district councillor from another area committee, wouldn't have that right because they've got no interest to declare that precludes them debating the issue.
Yes, I think in principle that could arise, but I see the point.
Great. Councillor Swain, I think I'm going to sort of throw it open to see if anyone else has any questions. Thank goodness I'm not in your seat. Councillor Helm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned group meetings a minute or two ago. Surely they're private and confidential to that group, not anybody else. And what goes on in that group meeting is for that group, and not for code of conduct or anything like that.
Chairman, that's an interesting question. They are. That's true. I suppose the question is, in a group meeting, are you acting in the capacity of a councillor? So you're talking about council business, because this code only applies, just as the old code, so this new code only applies when you're acting in the capacity of being a councillor. And if you go to page, I'll find it. sorry, I'm still familiarising myself with this code. I'm not the old one. I knew where everything was. On this one, I don't. Yeah, if you go to page, I'm sorry, page 15. It sets out their application of the code of conduct. As you see here, the code of conduct, to an earlier question, Councillor Swain, you'll see the first paragraph. Code of conduct applies to you as soon as you sign your declaration of acceptance of office. This code applies to you when you're acting in your capacity as a councillor, which may include when you misuse your position as a councillor, or your actions will give the impression to a reasonable member of the public with knowledge of the facts that you are acting as a councillor. And then it sets out the different forms of communication that it applies to. Face-to-face meetings are included, so that will be group meeting. Now, the question is, I think, are you acting in your capacity as a councillor when you are attending group meetings? And I have to say that's not a clear-cut matter. There have been debates on that point, and there are better people than me that have argued that point. And my personal view, though there are better people than me who could answer that, would be, I don't think they are. I don't think you are acting in the capacity of a councillor, but I think it's a close shave.
Councillor Helm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Surely then you're acting as a member of a political group rather than a councillor. There are councillors behind me. So
You're a part of a political group discussing matters of council, but not in a council setting.
Yeah.
And some people think that that does engage the code, better people than me. And there are some I've seen who argue that it doesn't. So maybe under the new code, and maybe with this guidance, which again, I'm not 100% familiar with, I'm still coming to terms with it as well. I mean, I'm coming here trying to answer questions, but I'm still in a learning process as well. Maybe this code, there'll be and this guidance will enable us to have a clearer view on that. I haven't really addressed that particular point, to be honest with you. I'm speaking from the point of view of how I view things under the old code.
Councillor Helm.
thank you. I'll come back. So that means, does it mean then that the minutes of this group meeting can be made available for JSC?
If a councillor is acting as a person is acting as a councillor in a group meeting, and someone makes a complaint, then the monitoring officer has to investigate. Now, the secretary of that group may decline and say, no, I'm not giving you the, I'm secretary of the group, I'm not acting as a councillor in that regard, I'm not going to give you the minutes. The monitoring officer would then have the job of interviewing different people within that group without the benefit of the minutes. There is no power in the monitoring officer. It's not like the police or like a judge that has the power to order disclosure of documents. There is no power of disclosure. I couldn't come to you if you have a political group, Councillor Helm, and say, I am ordering you to disclose your group minutes to me.
Thank you, Councillor Helm. Could I go to Councillor Thompson, please?
Thank you. It's just a very small matter of clarification, because I heard some muttering about, well, you wouldn't be there if you weren't a councillor. In actual fact, that's not quite true. I can see why it would be thought to be true of the independents, but political parties, certainly ours, and I imagine most, the local association chairmen are entitled to attend, and they're entitled to attend. So you might well have someone who's a councillor somewhere else, or on your own council, or not at all. So we do have people come who aren't councillors.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Councillor Beale, sorry, Mr. Shark, I will come to you in a second.
Thank you, Chairman. It's basically loosely connected with what Councillor Helms asked you. Surely if you're, for example, in a Conservative group or an independent group, and you're discussing full council agenda items, then you are dealing with it as a Conservative or an independent, and also as a member of the council. Otherwise, you wouldn't be discussing it in the first place.
I think that's a powerful argument, and that's the argument of those that believe that the code is engaged. But that's a powerful argument.
Okay. Can I just go to Mr. Mitchell, please?
Thank you, Chairman. Just a small point, really. In my experience, that when you do get ructions within groups, it's very unusual that they finish up in front of the monitoring officer, and they would normally go through the party system for any appropriate, and I've seen that happen. I don't know about independents, but certainly in the three main political parties, I've seen that dealt with outside the organisation completely, and that wouldn't normally be a matter for this committee to get engaged with.
Thank you.
Chairman, that's helpful actually, because I had a particular case under the existing code, and that's exactly the finding I made, that is a matter for party discipline, not a matter for the monitoring officer.
Thank you. Councillor Mayers, please.
I just wanted to say we should all behave politely and respectfully to one another,
That would be
irrespective.
Absolutely.
So, thank you.
Peace. Councillor Swain.
Just a quick one on that. Yes, okay, discussion within a group. But if there is pressure to vote a particular way, is there not undue influence?
It is. The question is the code engaged? And that's the very issue we're debating. In a group meeting, is the code engaged or not? And under the old code, I formed the view that really the independent person has just expressed. Whether that turns out to be the case under the new code, particularly with this guidance, will be interesting. And I'm going to rely on better people than me in other local authorities to see how they decide that. If it's not in the capacity of being a councillor, Councillor Swain, then even though it's undue influence, it's not the code that's engaged. That will be a matter for the party to deal with. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Quelch. Anybody else? Oh, good. Okay, Berna, how do I move forward now? Because we are going to, we have an amendment, don't we, which...
Yes, we have an amendment to Appendix 1, Paragraph 9, Section A, to include the word well-being. And I believe it was put to the committee earlier via Councillor Thompson, and it was
seconded.
Seconded.
Yes, it was.
That was my understanding. So that obviously, together with the substantive recommendation, now needs to be put to the committee.
I think the only thing I would say, I mean, I agree with what Mrs. Casey has said. I always agree with Mrs. Casey.
So do I.
Is that also it's been proposed and seconded, but it also needs to be voted on by the committee to become a part of the substantive motion.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Okay.
So, do we now actually vote on that? Can we do that?
You
now?
vote firstly on whether the amendment put forward by Councillor Mrs. Thompson actually now forms a part of the original proposal. And if members here say yes to that, then you vote on that original proposal with the amendment in it.
Right. Great. So we shall, Councillor Beale.
Is this relating in any way to what I forgot he was a councillor now? Mrs. Welch has actually said that he's going to increase his power. Is that coming within that, or is that in the next vote?
All right.
No, I think we're, yeah, no, I don't think we're increasing Mr. Quilter's power any more than we have to. I think I think we're just giving him the sort of the bandwidth to, if he needs to, he can bring this in earlier than county council. That's all. So based on
Apologies for the interruption, Chairman, but can I be clear that, about that the amendment is in relation to what the monitoring officer suggested as an addition to paragraph 9, section A, to include the word well-being as well as financial interests. That is the amendment that we're discussing, because the monitoring officer just mentioned there now that it was an amendment brought forward by Councillor Thompson. I understood the only amendment on the table was the amendment that the monitoring officer suggested to paragraph within Appendix 1, paragraph 9, section A, to include the word well-being.
and I think that's what Councillor Thompson actually
It's on page
proposed.
23. Okay. Thank you very much. Just wanted clarity. There wasn't a second amendment of the
That's
table.
correct.
So
Page 23 in the papers. Thank you.
right. So just to make sure that I'm absolutely correct, could you read out, please, Bernard, the new amended recommendation that we're all going to vote? No.
No, we're just going to take the amendment first, Chairman. So if we take the amendment first and vote on that, and the amendment was at page 23 in the papers, Appendix 1, paragraph 9, section A, include the word well-being. So A, to a greater extent that it affects the financial interests and well-being of the majority of inhabitants.
Or well-being.
Or well-being, sorry.
Right.
Or well-being of the majority of inhabitants of the ward affected by the decision. So we need to vote on that first.
Thank you very much. So, Councillor Fleming. Oh. Good job this isn't a bidding thing, is it? You'd have bought it. Okay, so we've all heard what Bernard has told us. So should we vote on that now, please? Can I take that vote? So all of those agree. So it looks like we're agreeing by assent. Thank you. So that is now passed. Is that correct?
Yes, Chairman, that now goes as a recommendation to full council.
Thank you very much. And that's all we need to do, isn't it? No.
No, sorry, Chairman. And now that we need to take the substantive recommendation.
Okay, thank you. So let's take that substantial recommendation and we shall vote on that. Is that correct? Has it been proposed? We've done that, haven't we? No, please tell me. We have.
Yes, it was seconded, but we need to agree.
And so we have all voted on, yeah, that's been seconded. So can we vote for that one, please? Agreed, thank you. You're a tough gig. Thank you very much. So are we all clear on that, Bernard? Is that all absolutely correct?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So the next item I have are any other items of business that the chairman decides are urgent, and I certainly don't have any. And so I shall now close the meeting. But before I do so, I would just like to thank you all for a very, very productive meeting, and I must say a very polite meeting. So I shall now close the meeting at 15:14. Thank you.